Hi there everyone, it's Alex with another Drummer Artificer Studios. Today we're going to be doing another one of our jewelry techniques, and we're going to be learning how to use the file and sandpaper properly. So in jewelry work, probably one of the most crucial steps in your entire design and fabrication process is going to be finishing, and specifically the filing and the sanding. It is also one of the most tedious parts of the entire process. So once you've designed your piece and you fabricated most of the parts, before you can actually assemble and do your finishing work of buffing or whatever coloration or sealing you want to do to it, you have to refine the piece by doing the finishing. The filing and the sanding is what will really bring a piece together and make it look 100% complete and finished. In that, you have the two stages, filing and sanding. Obviously, most people should know what they are, files and sandpaper. It's pretty easy. But when you get into each of those categories, you have different things you have to take into consideration. So we're going to break it down into first the filing and then the sandpaper. So with the files, you have two different main things to keep into consideration, is the grit of the file and the size of the file. So you can get huge metalworking files and woodworking rasps and all sorts of stuff. Most jewelers, their large files will be something like this. This one has probably about 4 to 5 inches of teeth on it for you to be able to work with. These are fairly large files for jewelers, but you can use slightly larger ones. But it's got a pretty refined grit, but it's still pretty abrasive. After you would use this, you would move on to what most people refer to as needle files, because they are very small and look like almost knitting needles. And this is usually the last size of file that I will use when working on stuff. The files themselves, besides the grit, you have to consider the shape, because you've got a flat file, you've got a half round, where one side of it is going to be perfectly flat, the other side is going to be rounded so that you can do curves, and then you've got just a straight round file. Those carry over into the needle files as well. And the different shapes allow you to just do different things with the file and get into different areas of your piece. And generally you would go through the different grits. So if you have to remove a lot of material to get it to the exact shape you want, you would start with a larger, more abrasive file and then work your way down to the needle files to get the refined shape you want. You would then use the sandpaper to smooth everything out. Now, these aren't the only shapes and sizes of files you can get. There's all sorts of different types you can come across. You have square files and diamond files. You can get files that only have teeth on one surface, so that when you get it in, you don't have to worry about getting other areas scratched up. You can also find curved files, so that only one specific part of it is going to hit your material. There's all sorts of different options you can do. These are all more traditional files. You can also get diamond files that will give you a different finish when you're done with it. So many different things you can do. But those 3 shapes and these 2 grits are really the basics that you'd want to use for most jewelry work. Now, an important thing about working with the file that I will again cover later is the fact that the teeth only go in one direction. Remember that, it will come into play later. So once you've got all your refining and shaping done with the files, it is time for you to move on to the sandpaper. And what the sandpaper will do is help remove all of the file marks and give you a smooth, finished, uniform surface for you to do whatever your final stage is going to be, whether it's going to be buffing or tumbling or whatever you want. Some of the different finishing techniques for the end can cover up some of your crimes, but specifically if you are going to be buffing, the sanding is a crucial step that you cannot skip and you cannot take any shortcuts on. Like the files, you have different grits. More people will be familiar with grits of sandpaper because they hear about it when doing any form of basic woodworking. With jewelry, however, you have 3 primary grits that you will focus on. You have a 320, a 400, and a 600 grit. You can get more abrasive, which means the number gets smaller, or you can get more fine, where the number gets larger. I've seen people use up to like 15,000 grit to do stuff, but to me that's kind of insane. But these 3 grits are going to be the main thing you want to focus on. All of these you can probably find at your local hardware store. You don't have to go to a special jewelry place to be able to find it. And I generally, though it isn't necessary for jewelry, try to stick with a wet-dry sandpaper. That way, if I want to do something where I get the paper wet and continue to sand, it won't affect the sandpaper at all. So, like the files, what you would do is once you're done with all your filing, to start removing the file marks and get your finished surface, you would start with your 300 grit sandpaper. You keep using this, I should say, you're supposed to keep using this until all the marks from the last layer of filing are completely gone. You keep going and keep going and keep going until there are no longer any file marks whatsoever. That's why it's crucial to go through different grit levels of the files to try and remove all the large marks before you get to the sandpaper. Once you're done with the 320 grit, you would move on to the 400. And what you would actually do with the 400 is change directions. So on your 320, if you were going in this direction with your strokes, on the 420 you would want to go this way, because you're going to use the 400 until all the markings from the 320 are gone. Like I said, lots of sanding. Again, once that's done, you would move on to your 600, and you would repeat the process, but change direction again. Once you are done with the 600, you should be ready to do any of your final finishing, but those 3 layers are going to be crucial for you to be able to get your nice, finished, and refined surface. Something else that's crucial to know is once you get all that done, you're going to have to be very careful about putting fingerprints on this. Once it's down to that final 600, is going to be very smooth, very shiny, and the slightest oil from your hand will leave a fingerprint on it. Now, it's not like a high carbon steel where it will necessarily etch the metal, but if you don't want to go into any buffing or anything, and you don't want to have to remove fingerprints, you're going to have to be careful and probably wear gloves when doing it. But that is all a personal preference up to you. So now that I've gone over some of the basics on what you're supposed to do with the stuff, I'll actually show you what to do. And for this, I'm going to just be using our riveting sample piece. The edges of it are not even, they're not smooth, they're not refined, they're just still rough from them being cut out. So I'm going to use the files and sandpaper to refine this just to make it look a little bit nicer. So I'll start over here on this edge, where they're pretty close to even, but they're just off slightly and they haven't been finished at all. So I'm going to start, because I'm just doing straight edges, I'm just going to use a standard flat file. So I'm starting with my larger file. I'm going to brace it up on the bench pin. And I'm just going to start going away at it. Now, something crucial to note is here where I'm trying to remove more material, you'll notice I'm only cutting on the push. When I pull it back, I'm actually bringing it off the metal. That's because, like I said, there was going to be something crucial with the files. The teeth on a file only go in one direction. they do not cut on the pull. They only cut on the push. So you hold it by the handle, put it on the metal at the top of the file, and then push your way through it, and it will cut it. When you do this, it does nothing, and all you're doing is wasting energy. I'm also having the metal braced on the bench pin, because if I hold it and file like this, which I do occasionally when I don't want much to be removed, but if I file like this, or even like this, all that force of me pushing the file against the metal is just moving my hand, and I'm losing energy that way. So to conserve energy and make this go faster, you brace the metal on something, and then you only put pressure on it when you're doing the push. That way you're using the energy the best you can. So I know you probably can't see it very well, but if I can get the light, you can see this section right here is darker than everything else, and that's because the file has not yet started cutting that. This surface was higher, so it's removing all that material to get down to that lower level. So what I have to do is I have to keep filing this whole piece until it's all a uniform level. That's why this can take so much time. Okay, so I now have this all at a uniform smoothness. I'm going to switch over to my needle file and just do a little bit more on the surface, but with the needle file, what I'm more going to focus on are the corners, just to round them over slightly so they're not so sharp and rough. Okay, so I've knocked that all down now. Most of the marks are removed, and I've put a slight rounded corner on the edges there. So now it's time for us to sand it. So I'm starting with my 320 grit sandpaper. I've folded my little piece of it in half, and I'm going to put my thumb on the top, and I'm going to use that to brace it a little bit and just move it across. Now with sandpaper, it's not like a file. It doesn't have a direction to the grit, so you can go back and forth as much as you want. The other thing that can help a lot with sanding is to have some form of a backer surface on the sandpaper. Here I'm just using my hand, but what can benefit if you were to do something, taking a file or maybe use a stick of wood or something like that and put something hard in there to push the sandpaper with. It'll make it cut better, and again, it won't expel so much energy. You can buy sanding sticks. That is just a hard cardboard or thin piece of wood that has sandpaper attached to it. You can also make your own. I know makers like Adam Savage went years making his own sanding sticks by just taping whatever sandpaper he wanted onto a piece of wood like a painter's stick. But then he found out they had pre-made ones that he could buy. Most people will know pre-made sanding sticks as their other name, nail files. That's really all a nail file is. It's a piece of hard cardboard with sandpaper attached to it. You can buy them in different grits, and they accomplish the exact same thing. You can also buy sticks that are in different shapes that allow you to attach sandpaper to them so you can change the paper out. But by bracing the sandpaper like this, it makes it cut a lot better and a lot more refined. You just have to be careful with a file because I don't know if you'll be able to see that, but there's actually, I can see the teeth marks on the sandpaper from the file. They were cutting all the way through. Now, I'm not just going to sand this surface here. I'm going to sand this surface up here. Well, actually, I'll do it to, I'll do it to this side. There's more marks on this side of it. So now that I've done all that sanding, again, you might not be able to see much of it, but right around all the rivets, there's quite a few scratch marks, and that was from when I was removing the burr from drilling it. So if I really wanted this to be as refined as possible, I would have to file and sand the surface until all of those were gone. Now, because I'm not doing any form of a special finish to this, I'm not going to bother with that. But now that I've done the 320 grit, I have to move on to the 400 and then the 600 to do this whole process. Now with each subsequent grit, it does become a bit easier for you to do all the sanding because you've already removed most of the large sections that needed to get done with the previous grit. So it's still not the prettiest because I haven't done any other form of finishing to it yet, but that is all completely sanded now. I have also sanded and smoothed this surface of it. So I'm going to try and show you the difference between one that's been completely finished and sanded to this edge over here was just briefly hit with the needle file. I didn't really do any sanding to that side whatsoever, and that side hasn't had anything done to it. Again, that one has been sanded in the 3 different grits, and this side hasn't had anything done to it. Now from here, there's a number of different finishes that you could put on it. You could go and buff this with a buffing wheel. You could go and use it in a tumbler where it's rolled around in either stainless steel or ceramic pellets to put a burnished finish on it. Or you can hit it with steel wool or brass brush, something like that. I have started now and then to use just a simple Brillo pad. It's another layer of the sanding almost, but it specifically gives a slightly burnished finish to the piece. It also does slightly scuff up and scratch the surface. And this is one of those ways I mentioned that you can hide your crimes, so it's not as easy for somebody to see any marks that you might have left. So as you could have seen with that is I used that Brillo pad to give this a nice burnished finish to it. That is still a very cleaned up look for a piece of metalwork. The most difficult finish for you to put on any piece of jewelry or metalwork is a highly polished surface, because it means you have to have that base material flawless. There can't be any marks, any dents, any dings, any scratches. You have to do so many hours of finishing work, it's ridiculous to be able to get that nicely finished, polished surface. I have heard of jewelers that have been in the business for 20 years and decided to retire because they hated sanding. Because you have to do so much of it if you want that highly refined, polished surface. I know quite a few jewelers that manage to stay away from that entirely by doing different patinas or colorations on the metal, and it hides a lot of those scratches so you don't have to worry about it. it's not jewelry, but my first instructor, Dale Weedig, up at Northern Michigan University, most of his forged and manipulated steel furniture and stuff, he actually, he doesn't do any form of textured finish to try and make it look fancy. He actually hits it with different colors of spray paint and then scuffs the paint up with a wire brush to give it a more industrial look, because it means he doesn't have to worry about stray marks or scuffs in his piece. So you can find all sorts of ways to hide those crimes without having to spend hours and hours doing this refining work. Now, as with my other jewelry technique demos I've done, down in the description you will find a link to a handout with some basic information on filing and sanding. You might find it useful. It might be nice to just add to the collection of all the other ones I'm giving and any other paperwork and handouts you've found about metalworking during your explorations. I have an entire binder of them. So keep an eye out for the next video I put out. I'm not sure what it's going to be yet, but it should be interesting. This is Alex. You've been watching Drummer Artificer Studios. See you next time. The problem with filming in a garage with the door open is you got to wait for people to get past as they're walking.